So let's talk about the tips of using interpreters for tip number 89. Interviewing tip number 89 of 101 tips for interviewers and interrogators. I'm your host, Stan Walters, back with you again, and we're at 89. Let's talk about the issues and problems and challenges of working with interpreters. Now, in the U.S. and many countries that also get the video here that across the world that are subscribers, we know the challenges of working with somebody whose native language is not the same as our own. And many times we'll have to use interpreters to work with that person. So let's talk about the things you need to keep in mind and consider. I suggest on this one that you take some notes because there's quite a few things you need to take care of. First of all, you've got to figure out, don't wait until Friday morning at 3 a.m. that you need somebody in your whole area that might speak Slovene, for example. Because when you do find that person, you may not realize or not know that that interpreter may in fact be a relative of your subject and you're already compromised. So one of the problems that we have to think about, whose side is the interpreter on? Really, who are they working for? Early in the Gulf War, we had some contract interpreters that were down in Gitmo. And at one point, there was one interpreter that was headed back, I believe it was through Boston Logan Airport. I think that's right. He was caught with something like 50 DVDs that he had stolen from Gitmo, where some of the interrogations are going on of enemy combatants and some of the terrorists are held there. And was headed out of the country with it. So here they got a guy who's inside the operating system and has compromised the interrogation. I was talking to a federal agent who's a supervisor. He said, Stan, I speak enough Spanish to order off the menu and to get back across the border, that kind of stuff. Just rudimentary Spanish. So he was watching one of his agents conduct an interview and interrogation, and he was using a Spanish interpreter. And so my guy asked the question. He said, I'll catch the interpreter just enough of the Spanish that I can get that she has said to the subject, he wants to know this, be careful what you tell him, he's going to use this to deport you. And this investigator had no idea that that was going on. So you've got to do some vetting of those interpreters beforehand. So one of the things you need to do is look around, see what the larger population groups and language groups are in your community, and start identifying available interpreters now and vet them. One place to start, community college, liberal arts college, full college setting, and look at the language arts department and start talking to those folks. They'll know some interpreters. They'll have some that students are clarified. Some of them may be cleared themselves that you can call on. Don't settle for one for each language. Get 2 or 3 that you can find and make that list available to everybody in your agency or your company that you can call on if you need them to come in and interpret. When you set this up, when you get them, you need to spend a little time with interpreters, particularly if they're non-law enforcement. And in some cases, law enforcement, okay, if they've been working with before. Tell them not to take over the interrogation. I was working on a case briefly where they were interrogating a subject through an interpreter. It was a police officer who was acting as an interpreter. He made statements to the suspect that the interviewer didn't realize, and made some promises and made some remarks that contaminated the interview, and they lost part of the statement by the courts because of what the interpreter said the interrogator did not say. So you sat down and said, look, you cannot transliterate. You've got to tell me exactly what the subject said. Just don't summarize for me. And if I'm going to say something, ask something that doesn't translate into language, you got to adjust it. Let me know that, so I'll be aware ahead of time. Now, I've taught many years, particularly in the Middle East, and have interpreters. So I'm very used to the process and understand certain words and phrases don't work. And some cultural things. You can make some cultural mistakes that don't even have to do with language about how you approach that person depending on age, depending on status, relatives, wife, spouse, kids, husband, etc. So learn those cultural things. I know it's going to be a long list of things you got to do here. But if we're going to be effective at this, you need to plan ahead of time. My suggestion, if you are interviewing through an interpreter, for God's sake, please do us all a favor and record it. Please record those interviews, because what's going to happen, there will be arguments before the court. Did the subject understand their rights? Did the translator translate correctly? Did the interpreter misinterpret or mistranslate something that you said? And you need a record of that to show, or so that it can be looked at and reviewed, and it's quality control. Wouldn't hurt to have somebody else review that interview recording also to make sure that something untoward has gone on between the interpreter and the subject. So find a way to record those, video or audio, but at least do that. In other locations that you can find an interpreter. Last I knew, there was a company called Language Line. Language Line. I ran across it doing some work for some Chicago judges at a conference and was exposed to it. And they use it for arraignments. You actually go online, you can have an account. You might check with your circuit court clerk's office or whatever's similar to that. Quite often the court clerk's office has access to it, or they have an open account. But find out their contact. So what will happen, you contact them and say, I need somebody that speaks, for example, Chinese. And you get a certified interrogator or an interviewer, translator online. You'll get a number and, like an ID number for that person, so you can reach out to them if possible. And then you also want to record this, okay? But they'll be able to tell you, yeah, that's Chinese, but that is Cantonese. I speak Mandarin, for example. And they'll correct you and make sure you got the right interpreter in place for you. And that works over the phone, by the way. Get what's called a Polycom or a Clear One or something similar. They are phones that you use, a conference call phones where you can hear everybody in the room. And there is a spot in the side of those where you can take a little stereo mini pin and plug into your recorder, and you get both the voices of the interpreter and anybody who's talking in the room. Makes a really good, clean, digitized recording. So look at getting that Polycom or a Clear One speakerphones, okay, to work on that. Now, the other thing you need to consider, spontaneous or delayed. Spontaneous translations, like, for example, if you watch in politics, or you see in high-stakes negotiation, one country with another, and world leaders are meeting with each other, and they'll have interpreters. They're typically doing a spontaneous translation. So as the world leaders are talking, they're translating almost just a few words right behind them. So it's almost like an ongoing translation or conversation. The problem with that in the interview room, because you're going for a much longer period of time, you can burn up a spontaneous translator very quickly. It takes a lot of concentration, takes a lot of energy, and they'll start to get brain tired very quickly. So that's a very hard one to do. I used the delayed translation when I was teaching. Now it takes twice as long to do, but you don't burn up your interpreter, and gives the interpreter time to catch if there's something amiss, or they can warn you that your word is wrong, or they need a clarification on a particular your meaning, so they can translate it to that person. So usually delayed translation is better, at least in my opinion. But something you should do when you find your translators is sit down and let them work with you and teach you and practice, if you're doing a lot of them, or going to. And you kind of get a rhythm and you understand. And I got very comfortable. My two translators, Raj and Hanya, and they understood what I was doing, and they had my workbook, and it was easy to translate for those folks. And then he began to keep notes, and we would talk beforehand. Now that's in a classroom setting, but the interview setting, it's very fluid. You don't know what the direction the conversation is going. So think about ahead of time what you might do when you encounter a person, a new translator, where you find them, whose side they're on, vet them, record it. Think about delayed or spontaneous translation. Get a little practice ahead of time to get used to it, and realize that you will encounter this more and more and more in your job. And it's critical for services, not just for suspects, but also for victims and witnesses, that you have these translators in place so you can serve them and communicate them and collect the information you need to move forward in your investigation. Got it? Okay, good. Facebook, LinkedIn, please hit the like button. Please share. I really appreciate it. I need to share, really expand my group, expand the subscriber list here to add them on, and raises the ratings of the videos. If you're looking for good, in-quality, innovative, I don't do the old rehash stuff, constant researching, adding innovative interview and interrogation training for your agency. You want a custom design course or host one, give me a call. Let's talk about it and see what I can do, a very cost-effective program for your folks. So until I see you again for tip number 90, this is Stan Walters reminding, be safe.